Okay, let's resume speaking about the origins of early modern Homo sapiens. And the earliest evidence we have for them is in Africa. The sites of Omo and Herto in Ethiopia are between 150 and 200,000 years ago. Those are the oldest widely agreed upon Homo sapiens anatomically modern human sites in the world. Although there's some more recent evidence, it's not even in your book, it's so recent, from some other places in Africa. Places like Morocco have some more controversial evidence, possibly for some evidence as early as this. So across different places in Africa, we start to see Homo sapiens emerging as with anatomically modern features. So, like we saw emerging from Homo erectus, archaic Homo sapiens groups in Europe, a distinct type of species emerging, we see this new distinct type of species starting to emerge in Africa as well, but it is us. The earliest evidence that we have for Homo sapiens comes from Africa, and we see a lot of different sites that start to, from about 200,000 years to about 100,000 years ago, we see them start to develop these anatomies that I've mentioned before, the higher forehead, as opposed to the earlier Homo erectus. The higher forehead with a rounder skull rather than that football-shaped skull. The face is reduced in size and it's less protruding. The teeth are smaller, and there's a pronounced chin that starts to emerge, and the postcranial skeleton is more gracile. Now, this is also a feature of the fact that Africa is a warm environment. So the archaic Homo sapiens developing in Europe, the Neanderthals, had more robust skeletons because they were cold adapted. The archaic Homo sapiens in Africa, which is us, anatomically modern humans, developed more gracile features because more elongated bodies is an adaptation for warm environments. So this is us. The anatomical features that we see emerge in Africa is by far the oldest examples of these are coming from Africa. Herto is the earliest. It's remarkably modern features with taller overall skull from Herto, a vertical forehead, smaller brow ridge, and a smaller face tucked under a really large brained cranium that's sort of globular rather than more elongated. At this site of Herto in Ethiopia, over 600 stone tools have been found. Some used to butcher game, there's evidence for that. But their tools were not just evidence on fauna, there is evidence for cut marks on human bones as well. And so it looks like humans, just like their Neanderthal cousins, may very well have been practicing either cannibalism or defleshing of human remains as well. We need to keep in mind, however, that the way that anatomies emerge is not just genetic. It's also through use. We saw this in our earlier chapters on developmental biology. And so different individuals and different groups are going to have variations on the way that they look and the way that they developed based on what they eat and what their environment is. And so not all Homo sapiens become gracile and have these features emerge in the same exact way. So in fact, some robusticity continues, this sort of late Homo erectus robusticity continues in many places around the world until agriculture starts. So the last on our list of 6 human characteristics from about 10,000 years ago, everybody starts to move into this development in the direction of agriculture. Not everybody, but it has a huge impact on our anatomy. And because that changed our diet to softer foods, we're chewing less, and we're not using our faces in the same way. We'll come to this in the next chapter when we start talking about that. But some groups retained robusticity until very late. There's a skull that you can see on one of the slides of modern Homo sapiens in Africa that had very heavy robusticity with wide flaring cheekbones and prominent brow ridges. That's about 9,500 years old. But a more gracile skull from this similar deposits or from a similar time period about 6,500 years ago is more gracile. And so different groups have different survival strategies, and that has different effects on their anatomy based on developmental biology rather than necessarily inheritance. So Homo sapiens emerge with these anatomical features in Africa. And much the same way as we saw in the last chapter with Homo erectus, that this was a recipe for success, that the sort of anatomical features that Homo erectus had suddenly led to a pretty rapid expansion out of Africa into the rest of the old world. But when Homo sapiens started to emerge, anatomically modern humans started to emerge in Africa, a similar sort of thing happened, is that it was very successful. You had a spread out of this core area after a period of time and into the rest of the world. We're going to look at that for the rest of this chapter, but the difference between when this happened to anatomically modern humans and when Homo erectus emerged and left Africa. When Homo erectus left Africa, there were no other hominins in the world. They were all in Africa, and Homo erectus went into pretty much a blank canvas, an open area with no other hominins to compete with. Whereas now, Homo sapiens are going to be moving into territory where archaic Homo sapiens of various different types already live. In Asia, in Europe, in Indonesia. And they also go farther, as we will see. So the first early modern humans, Homo sapiens to leave Africa, we see, as you might expect, in the Middle East, in Southwest Asia. Sites in Israel, Schul and Kafza, these are cave sites in Israel. They have many modern characteristics like the high forehead and the round globular skull. But these are also found in the same locations where Neanderthal fossils have also been found. And it's quite possible that humans and Neanderthals were interacting and maybe even co-inhabiting these same caves. So, like I mentioned before, it might be difficult to pick out a Neanderthal on a bus today. If you were to dress them up in clothes and raise them in a normal human family, we might not be able to tell the difference between a Neanderthal and a human unless you pointed it out to us. Well, this might be a similar situation with Homo sapiens or anatomically modern humans leaving Africa, going into a location where other Neanderthals exist. Why would they know that they're a different species if they could talk, they could walk, they could hunt, they could interact? And as we'll see, they might have even been able to mate. The clearest unambiguous evidence is that those caves are about 60,000 years old, and so it's possible that humans might have left Africa as early as 90,000 years ago, but the clearest unambiguous evidence is about 60,000 years ago, and we have very good evidence from even farther afield in Asia, in China and in Laos. In Southeast Asia, going back to the Zhakudian caves, which we saw last chapter, we see that there are anatomically modern humans that appear there at about 40,000 years ago, and at very least by 30,000 years ago in the Zhakudian caves. And they have all of the anatomically modern features that you would expect, including features that you see in Asian populations today. One surprise that we found just a couple of decades ago that was discovered on the island of Flores in Indonesia was another species of archaic Homo sapiens that went in a different direction. We saw that Homo erectus was trending towards larger brains and was trending, at least in the terms of Neanderthals, even really very big brains and robust, stocky bodies. Well, on the island of Flores in Indonesia, it appears as though that trend went in a different way. That Homo erectus that landed on the island of Flores seems to have exhibited island dwarfism. That they became smaller, their brains became smaller as well, and their bodies were more Australopithecine-like. And so they started to trend in a different direction. I don't want to say they became more archaic or archaizing or primitive. That's not the way that evolution works. The adaptations that they made on that island were for to be only about 3.5 feet tall, a very small brain, only about 400 cc's, but they would have walked on 2 feet, so they were bipedal. So you can see that there were different strategies for survival in different places, and they resulted in this case, what's called Homo floresiensis, named after the island of Flores. And this would have, you would expect for something like this to be extremely ancient, but actually this was only about 100,000 to 60,000 years old. So it's even possible that humans might have interacted and encountered Homo floresiensis. It's conceivable that humans, like you and me, leaving Africa, moving into this territory, might have encountered these small creatures of late archaic Homo erectus that developed along a different line. You wouldn't have been able to walk with them. You wouldn't have been able to talk with them. You wouldn't have been able to mate with them. They had diverged and drifted so genetically far away along a different line that it was a survival of a different strategy, a different type that would not have been compatible with us. So humans were encountering these Homo erectus groups, like Homo floresiensis, but they also encountered Neanderthals. And in Europe, Neanderthals were flourishing. They were cold adapted, and in the glacial periods, in the late Pleistocene, you needed to be able to cope with the cold weather. And so when humans moved into this region, they were heat adapted, but they must have come up with some cultural types of workarounds, shelters, fire, clothing, these sorts of things. They must have had to be able to deal with the extremely cold weather that was there. But they encountered these anatomically adapted Neanderthals that were really well suited for the cold environment. And it's possible, we'll come back to some more evidence for this in a moment, but it's been noted for a long time that the European humans that migrated into Europe from Africa started to take on characteristics that they shared with Neanderthals. Features like the high nasal angle, the laterally positioned cheekbones, and the anatomy of the base of the bone of the nose, and also the cheekbone structure, cheekbone suture, are things that both Neanderthals and European humans of modern European humans shared. And so there was long been speculation that maybe these two groups that encountered one another blended together and were able to interbreed. And so are modern Europeans a combination of African Homo sapiens and whatever relic population of Neanderthals were still living in Europe when humans came in there? Well, we'll see in a moment. These early modern Homo sapiens that started to move into Europe appeared even later than you see in Asia. So only about 30,000, 35,000 to about 30,000 years ago, from the cave that we saw before, Dolní Vostonica in the Czech Republic or Czechia, and Cro-Magnon in France, the very famous Cro-Magnon site that has revealed some of the earliest fossil evidence, or actually these are now bones, not fossils, from Homo sapiens in Europe. So what happened when Homo sapiens move into this area? They're encountering Neanderthals. And a strong proponent of the idea that Neanderthals were not a separate species but contributed to the genes of modern humans, especially those in Europeans, is an anthropologist named Milford Wolpoff. And he, it's no doubt that Neanderthals were dwindling and their population was diminishing by about 30,000 years ago. So when humans were coming in, Neanderthals were starting to diminish in numbers. But they did actually encounter, they would have lived side by side and would have encountered one another. So did they interbreed? A site that Milford Wolpoff came across in Portugal called Lagarvelo came up with a child that has anatomical features that show some evidence for Neanderthal characteristics and some for anatomically modern human characteristics. It's a combination of human and Neanderthal-like features. So especially the postcranial robusticity is very Neanderthal-like, but a lot of the cranial features are human-like. So is this an example of a child being born of a Neanderthal and human parents? Possibly. The only way to know would be able to access DNA, right? Well, amazingly, now that we're talking about bones, we have been able to do that. So I'll come back to that in just a moment. So again, let me just recap here that anatomically modern humans are first seen in Africa. And we see them start to leave Africa. They appear in Africa about 200,000 years ago, and by about 100,000 years ago, we start to see them starting to possibly emerge out of Africa. And certainly by 60,000 years ago, they're in Southwest Asia, and by 40,000 years ago, they're in Southeast Asia, China, Laos, and other places. The last place that they go to is going to be in Europe. Not the last place ever, but the last place that they encounter archaic Homo sapiens, other archaic Homo sapiens, is the Neanderthals in Europe. And there they actually bring new technology, they develop new ways of coping with the cold, and they possibly even interbred with Neanderthals. So let's use this evidence to try and assess our models that we looked at before, right? So is it an out of Africa hypothesis where there's one origin point for all humans and everybody else was replaced? Or is it a lot of origin points across the old world, from gene flow just building up a new species through interaction? Well, in the end, the answer is complicated. It's kind of a combination of both. Certainly, anatomically modern humans are first found in Africa, but when they go out of Africa, they start to encounter other developed archaic Homo sapiens species like Neanderthals, and as we'll come to in a moment, Denisovans, that they assimilated with, that they mixed with. So this is actually an assimilation model for human variation, that actually we are the result of both out of Africa our features emerging from Africa, but when we moved into the rest of the world, we encountered other groups and were able to interbreed with them. And some of the genetic variation is actually the result of these different subspecies interacting. So it's actually a combination of the multi-regional continuity hypothesis that we saw at the start of this chapter and the out of Africa hypothesis. The DNA that we have from the bones backs this up. Both modern DNA in human populations that exist today and also ancient DNA that we see for the interactions. So in one surprise that we got, let me just go back to Europe for a moment, where humans are interacting with Neanderthals. Well, as it turns out, the DNA shows that between about 1 and 4% of modern humans, especially those in Europe, have Neanderthal DNA. We've been able to extract and analyze the genome of Neanderthals, and we can compare that to the human genome, and they are different, but some of that genome appears in humans. And the highest concentration of Neanderthal DNA appearing in humans is in Europe, as you would expect. And it's less common to find that elsewhere. The other thing that you would expect if this was taking place is maybe there's some other archaic Homo sapiens species that exist out there that we haven't found a lot of evidence for. And just a few years ago, in a cave site in southern Siberia called Denisova, has revealed a few bones and teeth from a 40,000-year-old hominin that has been just called Denisovan after the cave site in which it was found. We don't have a lot of bones, we don't know a lot about their anatomy, but we have been able to extract their DNA, and as it turns out, it is not a Neanderthal, and it is not a modern human. It's not an anatomically modern human. It's something else. So it's another archaic Homo sapiens species. And sure enough, when humans encountered it, we must have interbred with them, because humans from East Asia, and especially in Melanesia, and now some new studies just this year have shown that there's may have been multiple different Denisovan groups that went to different places. The highest percentages are being from, as I said, East Asia and Melanesia, interbred with humans and then went to these locations. So this is confirming through DNA that this combination of out of Africa and multi-regional, which is the assimilation model for human variation, is being backed up by the DNA. So that takes us into where, as far as anatomically modern humans